The first time Elvira Rhodes ever saw her father's hands shake was the night he lost the deed to their homestead on a hand of 5-card draw he swore up and down he had won. Deadwood, Dakota Territory, sat thick with gold dust and gun smoke in the autumn of 1877, a town thrown up so fast along the gulch that half its buildings still smelled of green pine sap, and the other half smelled of whiskey and unwashed men fresh off the diggings. The Golden Spur was the loudest of its saloons, all lantern light and cigar haze, and it was there, at a table stained dark with tobacco spit and old blood, that Silas Rhodes had staked everything he owned against a man named Cyrus Vane. Elvira had not been in the room. She had been 3 streets over, mending a torn petticoat for the banker's wife by candlelight, her fingers moving fast and sure the way they always did, the way her mother had taught her before consumption took her 4 winters past. She had not seen the moment Cyrus Vane laid down 4 kings, cool as a Sunday sermon, and declared her father a cheat before the whole saloon. She had not seen the way the room had gone silent, then ugly, then loud again with jeering laughter as 2 of Vane's men dragged Silas Rhodes out into the mud of Main Street and left him there with his coat torn and his pride broken clean in half. What she had seen, when she came running with her skirts hiked up past her ankles and her breath tearing in her chest, was her father on his knees in the muck, blood at the corner of his mouth, and men she had known by name for 2 years now spitting near his boots and calling him a low-down card sharp who deserved worse than he got. "Papa," she had said, kneeling beside him, not caring one lick about the mud soaking into her only good dress. "Papa, what happened?" Silas Rhodes had looked up at her with eyes gone glassy and lost, an old man's eyes though he was not yet 50, and he had said the words that would carve themselves into her heart for the whole of that terrible autumn. "I lost it, Elvira. I lost the house. I lost everything your mother and I built. And now they say I cheated to do it, and God help me, I cannot even remember the hand clear enough to swear I did not." That had been 3 weeks past. In those 3 weeks, the Rhodes name had gone from respectable, if modest, to something men spat when they said it. Silas had once been the finest gambler between Cheyenne and the Black Hills, a man other players sought out for the honest challenge of him, a man who had taught his only daughter the mathematics of odds and the reading of faces before she was 12 years old, sitting her on his knee in their old parlor back in Kansas, and showing her how a man's thumb would twitch when he held a pair worth protecting. Now Silas Rhodes could not walk into the mercantile without the clerk's eyes sliding away from him, could not sit in church without hearing the whispers ripple down the pew like a current of cold water. And Cyrus Vane, who owned the Golden Spur and half the claims worth owning along the gulch besides, sat in his velvet-back chair every night running his games and smiling his slow, oiled smile, wearing Silas Rhodes's homestead deed in his coat pocket like a trophy. Elvira Rhodes was 22 years old that autumn, dark-haired and sharp-eyed, with a jaw that set stubborn when she was crossed, and a way of going quiet and watchful that most men in town mistook for shyness. She was not shy. She had simply learned, in the weeks since her father's ruin, that a woman who watched carefully learned a great deal more than a woman who spoke her mind too soon. She had taken in sewing and laundry to keep them fed, since her father could no longer find honest work in a town that believed him a cheat, and she scrubbed collars and hemmed skirts with a fury that had nothing to do with the fabric and everything to do with the fire building low and steady behind her ribs. She had not forgotten a single thing her father had taught her at that kitchen table in Kansas. She intended to use every bit of it. It was on a gray morning in early October, with frost silvering the boardwalks and the smell of wood smoke hanging heavy over the gulch, that Oscar Monroe rode into Deadwood at the tail end of a cattle drive-up from Texas, tired, trail-worn, and looking for nothing more than a hot meal, a warm bed, and 3 days of rest before he turned around and headed back south. He was 26, broad through the shoulders from years of rope work and branding fires, with sun-browned skin and a quiet, careful way of moving that spoke of a man who had learned young to make himself small in rooms full of louder men. He had a gray gelding named Duster that he trusted more than most people, a colt he had fired in anger exactly twice in his life and regretted both times, and a heart that had been broken once, badly, by a woman back in Abilene who had chosen a banker's son over a cowhand with calloused hands and dust in his boots. He had told himself since then that he had no more use for love, that a man was better off with a good horse and steady work, and nothing more complicated than that. He did not know, riding down Main Street past the Golden Spur with mud spattering up from Duster's hooves, that he was about to be proven wrong. He first saw Elvira Rhodes on his second evening in town, standing outside the Mercantile with a basket of mended linens on her hip, while three of Cyrus Vane's men lounged against the porch rail and made low comments as she passed, comments about her father, about cheats and their daughters, about what a woman might do to settle a debt if she had nothing better to trade. Oscar had been leading Duster toward the livery, and he stopped without quite meaning to, watching the way Elvira's spine went straight as a fence post, the way she turned to face the three men square on instead of hurrying past. "My father," she said, in a voice that carried clear and cold down the street, "never cheated a man in his life until the night Cyrus Vane's table decided otherwise. You might tell your employer that a woman remembers who laughs at her father's ruin and she does not forget it kindly." One of the men, a barrel-chested fellow with a scar through his eyebrow, laughed outright. "That's so, Miss Rhodes, and what's a laundress fixing to do about it?" "Wait," Elvira said, "and watch." She walked on then, chin high, basket balanced on her hip, as though she carried nothing heavier than clean linen. And Oscar Monroe found himself grinning despite the tiredness in his bones, an unfamiliar warmth kindling somewhere behind his sternum that he did not have a name for yet. He asked about her that night over supper at the boarding house, and the widow who ran the place, a talkative woman named Mrs. Prout, told him the whole sorry tale of Silas Rhodes and the hand of cards that had ruined him, and of his daughter who scrubbed shirts by day and, folks said, sat up nights teaching herself the very game that had brought her family low, as though she meant to do something about it. "Foolish notion," Mrs. Prout said, refilling his coffee. "Cyrus Vane don't lose, not at his own table, not with his own deck. Man's crooked as a dog's hind leg, everybody knows it, but nobody can prove it, and even if they could, who dare cross him? He owns half this gulch outright and holds paper on most of the other half." Oscar said nothing to that, but he found himself thinking of the straight-backed young woman on the boardwalk long after he had gone up to his narrow bed, and he found himself, the next morning, walking past the little house at the edge of town where Silas Rhodes and his daughter now lived, instead of heading straight to the livery as he had told himself he would. He told himself he only meant to look. He was there past an hour before he admitted otherwise even to himself. Elvira was in the yard hanging wet linens on a line strung between two pines, her sleeves rolled to the elbow despite the morning chill, and when she saw him standing at the fence with his hat in his hands, she did not smile exactly, but something in her face eased a fraction, as though she recognized in him a man who was not there to gawk or gossip. "You're the drover," she said. "Come up from Texas with the Barquet herd. Mrs. Prout mentioned you at breakfast, though she didn't have anything unkind to say, which around here makes you something of a rarity. Oscar Monroe, ma'am." He inclined his head. "I heard some talk about you yesterday, outside the Mercantile. You heard three of Cyrus Vane's hired men enjoying themselves at my father's expense, you mean. She pinned a shirt to the line with more force than the task strictly required. It is a popular pastime in this town at present." "I didn't much care for it," Oscar said. "The way they talked." Something flickered across her face then, quick as a bird's shadow, surprise maybe, or the beginning of something warmer. "No," she said slowly. "I don't suppose you would have if you're the sort of man who stops to notice such things." "I'm the sort of man who notices when somebody's being wronged," he said, and then, because his ears had gone hot and he was not entirely sure why, he added, My mother raised me better than to let that pass without at least taking note of it." Elvira studied him a long moment, the way Oscar imagined she might study a hand of cards laid face up on green felt, weighing and measuring, and then she said, "Would you like coffee, Mr. Monroe? It is not much, but it is hot, and my father would likely enjoy the company of a man who has not yet decided to hate him." That was how it began, with coffee in a small kitchen that smelled of wood smoke and lye soap, and Silas Rhodes sitting hunched by the stove looking a decade older than his years, his hands wrapped around a tin cup as though it were the only warm thing left to him in the world. Oscar listened to the old man talk, haltingly at first and then in a rush, about the game, about Vane's slow-oiled smile, about the sick certainty that had crept over him partway through the hand that something was not right, though he could not for the life of him say what. "I've played cards 30 years, Silas said. 30 years, and never once has a hand felt wrong to me the way that one did. But I couldn't prove a thing, couldn't prove a single thing, and so here we sit, ruined, and that snake sitting pretty with my land in his pocket. Papa built that homestead with my mother's own 2 hands, Elvira said quietly, sitting across from Oscar with her own cup untouched before her. "Every board of that house, every fence post. It is not just land, Mr. Monroe. It is the only thing left of her." Oscar looked at the two of them, the broken old man and his fierce, careful daughter, and felt something shift and settle in his chest, some decision arriving before he had consciously made it. "I'm meant to head back south with the outfit in a few days," he said. "But I've got some money saved, and I've got nowhere I'm needed before spring calving. Seems to me a man could do worse with his time than see a wrong righted." Elvira's eyes came up sharp to his face. "You would help us, a stranger." "I wouldn't call myself a stranger for much longer if you'll let me stay a while," Oscar said, and felt his own boldness surprise him even as he said it. For the first time since he had ridden into Deadwood, Elvira Rhodes smiled at him, small and real, and Oscar Monroe understood. With the same quiet certainty a man feels when a storm is coming on the wind, that he had just changed the whole course of his life, and he was not sorry for it. The days that followed fell into a rhythm neither of them spoke of directly, but both of them came to treasure. Oscar sent word to the trail boss that he would not be riding back south with the outfit, a decision that cost him the balance of his pay for the drive, but which he made without hesitation. He took work at the livery stable to keep himself fed, and to have some excuse to remain in Deadwood without the whole town wondering too loudly at his purpose. And in the evenings, when the light went long and gold over the gulch, he walked to the little house at the edge of town and sat at the kitchen table while Elvira taught him what she knew of cards, not so that he might play, but so that he might understand what she meant to do. "A man like Vane does not simply have luck," she told him one evening, laying out a hand of cards on the worn table between them. "He has method. He marks decks, he signals his men, he watches a player's hands and face until he knows the shape of every tell they carry, and then he uses that knowledge like a blade. My father taught me those same tricks years ago, not so that I might cheat, but so that I might recognize cheating when I saw it. What he never taught me was how a person outplays a cheat without becoming one herself. And you mean to figure that out?" "I mean to beat him clean," Elvira said, and there was iron in her voice. "I want no one able to say the Rhodes name won by trickery. I want to sit at that table and take back what is ours with nothing but skill and nerve, so that when it is done, no one in this town can whisper otherwise." Oscar watched her shuffle the cards, quick and practiced, her dark eyes narrowed in concentration, and felt a fierce admiration rising in him that he was slow to name for what it was. He had known plenty of women in his 26 years, dance hall girls and ranchers' daughters and the one back in Abilene who had broken his heart clean through, but he had never known a woman who burned the way Elvira Rhodes burned, quiet and controlled on the surface and fierce as a prairie fire underneath. "Teach me," he said. "Teach me what you know." Maybe I can't sit at that table for you, but I can learn to watch a room the way you do. Two sets of eyes catch more than one. So she taught him. She taught him to watch a man's collar for the telltale sheen of a hidden mirror sewn into a hat brim, to watch fingers for the small hesitations that meant a card was being palmed or a deck was being shorted. She taught him the rhythm of an honest deal versus a dishonest one, the way a crooked dealer's cards seemed to fall just a fraction too smooth, too silent, against the felt. Oscar proved a quicker study than either of them expected, his cowhand's patience for watching cattle and weather translating easily into patience for watching hands and faces. And in the evenings after their lessons, they would sit on the porch step with the last of the coffee gone cold between them and talk of other things, easier things. His mother's ranch outside San Antonio, her memories of Kansas summers before her mother had taken sick. The particular loneliness of being the only one in a room who understands what is truly happening. It was on one such evening, with the first hard frost of the season silvering the grass and Elvira's shawl pulled tight around her shoulders, that Oscar found himself saying more than he had meant to. "There was a woman," he said, looking out at the dark line of the hills rather than at her. "Back in Abilene. I thought I was going to marry her. Turned out she had different notions once a banker's son came sniffing around with better prospects than a cowhand could offer. I told myself after that I had no more use for it. Love, I mean. Told myself a good horse and honest work was plenty." "And do you still believe that?" Elvira asked very quietly. Oscar turned to look at her then, at the firelight from the kitchen window catching the edge of her face, at the steady, searching way she watched him, and he found the old certainty had gone soft and uncertain in his chest. "I'm not so sure anymore," he admitted. "I've met a woman lately who has made me wonder if I was wrong about all of it." Color rose in Elvira's cheeks, visible even in the dim light, and for a long moment neither of them said anything at all, the silence stretching taut and warm between them, full of a thing neither was quite ready to name aloud. Then Silas's voice called from inside, asking after the coffee pot, and the moment broke, gentle as a soap bubble, though neither of them forgot it. It was not all quiet evenings and careful lessons, however. Cyrus Vane was not a man who let a wound to his pride go unwatched, and it did not take long for word to reach him that the gambler's daughter was keeping company with a Texas drover and asking pointed questions about his methods around town. Vane was a tall man, silver-templed and handsome in the way of a well-fed wolf, with cold blue eyes and hands that had never done an honest day's labor in their life, and he did not care for the notion that a laundress and a cowhand imagined they might unseat him. He sent 2 of his men to make that clear. It happened on a Thursday evening, as Elvira was walking home from delivering a mended coat to the assier's wife, the light already fading purple over the gulch. Oscar had walked her partway, as had become his habit, but had turned back at the livery to see to dust her before full dark, and it was in that gap, no more than 10 minutes, that the same scar-browed man from the mercantile porch stepped out from the mouth of an alley with a companion at his shoulder, both of them smelling of whiskey and trouble. "Evening, Miss Rhodes," the scarred man said, blocking her path with his bulk. "Mr. Vane thought you and your cowboy friend might want reminding that some doors don't open twice. You do well to leave off whatever fool notion you've got cooking, before somebody decides you need a stronger reminder than words." Elvira did not step back, though her heart hammered hard enough that she could feel it in her throat. "You may tell Mr. Vane," she said, "that I intend to sit at his table, and I intend to win, and there is nothing he can say to a laundress in an alley that will change that." The second man laughed, low and ugly, and reached out to take her arm, and it was at that exact moment that Oscar Monroe came around the corner of the livery, having finished with duster faster than he had intended, some instinct pulling him back toward the road Elvira would have walked. He took in the scene in a single heartbeat, the hand closing on her arm, the fear beneath her defiance, and something in him went cold and clear the way it had the 2 times in his life he had drawn his Colt in anger. He did not draw it now. He simply closed the distance at a run and put himself between Elvira and the 2 men, his shoulders squared, his voice low and hard in a way that surprised even him. "Take your hand off her," he said, "or I promise you, you will regret it before this night is through." The scarred man sized him up, weighing the width of his shoulders and the set of his jaw, and something in Oscar's stillness must have convinced him the threat was not idle bluster, because after a long moment he let his hand drop from Elvira's arm. "This ain't your fight, cowboy," he muttered. "It is now," Oscar said. "You tell Vane that if he's got a quarrel with the Rhodes family, he can settle it fair at a card table like a man, instead of sending hired hands to frighten women in alleys. And you tell him further that I'll be sitting right beside Miss Rhodes when she takes his measure, and I will be watching every single thing his hands do." The 2 men exchanged a look, and then, muttering curses, they withdrew back into the alley and were gone, and Elvira let out a breath she had not realized she was holding and found, to her own surprise, that her legs had gone weak beneath her. Oscar caught her elbow, gentle this time, steadying rather than restraining, and for a long moment they simply stood there in the fading light, close enough that she could feel the warmth coming off him even through her shawl. "Are you hurt?" he asked, his voice rough. "No," she said. "Frightened but not hurt, thank you, Oscar." It was the first time she had used his given name without the courtesy of Mr. attached to it, and something about the sound of it in her voice settled deep in his chest like a stone dropped in still water. "I meant what I said," he told her. "I aim to be right there beside you when you sit down at that table. I won't have you facing that snake alone." "You cannot play the hand for me," she said softly. "This has to be mine to win, or it means nothing." "I know it," Oscar said. "I only mean to make sure nobody tips the scales against you before the cards are even dealt. The winning part, that's yours. I wouldn't take that from you for anything in this world." They walked the rest of the way to the little house in silence, but it was not an uneasy silence, and when they reached the gate, Elvira turned to him with her chin lifted and her eyes bright even in the dusk. "I am glad you came into this town, Oscar Monroe," she said. "I do not know what I would have done these past weeks without you." "You'd have managed," Oscar said. "You're the strongest person I believe I've ever met, but I'm glad I didn't have to find that out the hard way, watching from a distance." He wanted badly to say more, to close the small remaining space between them and press his lips to her forehead or her hand or anywhere she would allow. But he held himself back, some old caution from Abilene still whispering that a man ought not to move too fast on a heart he could not afford to have broken twice. He bid her good night instead, and walked back to the boarding house with his blood singing and his mind full of dark eyes and quiet courage. And Elvira stood at the gate a long while after he had gone, her fingers pressed to her own lips, wondering at the strange new warmth blooming beneath her ribs. The confrontation in the alley, rather than frightening her off her purpose, only hardened Elvira's resolve, and word of it, through whatever channels such things traveled in a town like Deadwood, reached Silas Rhodes and put a new light in his tired eyes. "You truly mean to do this?" he said to her that night, watching her practice her shuffle by lamplight, the cards moving through her fingers like water. "You mean to sit across from Cyrus Vane?" "I do, Elvira." Her father's voice cracked, and he reached across the table to still her hands with his own weathered ones. "If you lose, we have nothing left to lose. He already holds the house. If you sit at that table and it goes wrong, you could end up owing him a debt that follows you the rest of your days. I cannot ask that of you. I will not." "You are not asking it, Papa. I am choosing it." Elvira turned her hands in his and held them tight. "I have watched you become a shadow of the man who taught me every single thing I know about cards and courage both. I have watched this town look at you like something to be scraped off a boot heel. I cannot live with that, and I will not. I intend to win back the deed, and I intend to make Cyrus Vane confess before witnesses exactly how he cheated you, so that every soul in Deadwood knows the truth of what happened that night. And if he refuses to play you at all, a man like Vane has no obligation to sit across from a woman. "He will play me," Elvira said, "because I intend to make it a matter of his pride as much as mine. Men like Vane cannot resist a challenge they believe they will win easily, and he will believe that of a laundress with a foolish notion, right up until the moment the cards are on the table, and it is too late for him to withdraw without losing face before the whole gulch." Silas studied his daughter for a long moment, something shifting behind his tired eyes, some ember of the man he had once been stirring back to life at the sight of her fierce certainty. "Your mother would be proud of you," he said finally, his voice thick. "She always said you had more nerve than sense, God rest her soul, and I told her that was exactly the sort of daughter this world needed more of." "Then help me," Elvira said. "Help me remember every last thing you taught me. I need to be better than good, Papa. I need to be better than Vane at his own crooked game, playing it honest." And so father and daughter spent the following days bent over that same worn kitchen table, Silas coaching her through hand after hand, sharpening her instincts, testing her nerve with sudden reversals and bluffs of his own, until she could hold a stone face through anything he threw at her. Oscar sat in on many of these sessions, learning what he could, and in the evenings when the lessons were done, he and Elvira would walk together under the cold stars, talking of everything and nothing, the careful distance between them narrowing a little more with each passing night. It was on one such walk, some 10 days after the confrontation in the alley, with the challenge to Vane already delivered and accepted for a game to be held the following Saturday night at the Golden Spur, that Oscar finally found the courage to say the thing he had been carrying in his chest for weeks. They had stopped at the top of the small rise above the town, where the lights of Deadwood spread out below them like scattered gold coins, and the night was clear and cold and full of stars in a way that made a man feel very small and very certain all at once. "Elvira," Oscar said, and something in his tone made her turn to face him fully. "I have been trying to find the right way to say this since near about the first week I knew you, and I don't believe there is a right way, so I am simply going to say it plain. I have come to care for you more deeply than I have cared for any person in my life, and I do not say that lightly, given all that happened to me back in Abilene. You are the bravest, most clear-eyed woman I have ever known, and whatever happens Saturday night, win or lose, I want you to know that my feelings for you are not tied to any card game. I would feel this way about you if you never sat at that table at all." Elvira's breath caught, visible as a small cloud in the cold air, and for a long moment she said nothing, only looked at him with an expression he could not quite read in the starlight. "Oscar," she said finally, softly, "I have been afraid to hope for anything beyond winning back my father's honor. I told myself there was no room in my heart for anything else until that was settled. But you have made a liar of me these past weeks, because I find I think of you at every hour, and not merely as an ally in this fight. I think of you as something far more than that, and it frightens me, because I do not know what will be left of me if I lose Saturday night, and I cannot ask a man to bind his heart to a woman who may soon have nothing at all to offer him." "You have never had nothing to offer," Oscar said, closing the last small distance between them. "Not from the first evening I saw you standing up to those men outside the Mercantile with your chin high and your basket on your hip like you owned the whole street. You offered me the truest thing I believe a person can offer another, which is the sight of real courage, and I have been half in love with you since that very moment, though it has taken me this long to admit it even to myself." He reached up, slow and careful, and touched her cheek with fingers roughened by rope and rain, and Elvira did not pull away. Instead she leaned into his touch, her eyes closing briefly, and when Oscar bent his head and kissed her, gentle and searching, she rose up to meet him, her hands coming to rest against his chest, and for a long, suspended moment the whole cold and complicated world fell away, and there was only the warmth between them, steady as a hearth fire in winter. When they finally drew apart, both a little breathless, Elvira laughed softly, a sound Oscar had not heard from her before, light and surprised and full of a joy that had been buried under weeks of worry. "Well," she said, "I suppose now I have all the more reason to win on Saturday. I find I would very much like to have something worth building a future upon." "You would have had a future with me regardless," Oscar said, "but I will confess I like the notion of building it on a homestead instead of a boarding house room, if the choice is offered." They walked back down into town hand in hand, and if anyone in Deadwood noticed the change between the drover and the gambler's daughter, they were wise enough, for once, to keep their comments to themselves. Saturday arrived cold and clear, with the whole of Deadwood seeming to hold its breath as word spread through the saloons and the mercantile and the assay office that the Rhodes girl meant to sit down at Cyrus Vane's table that very night. By the time the sun dropped behind the western ridge and the lanterns were lit along Main Street, the Golden Spur was packed tighter than Elvira had ever seen it. Miners and merchants and gamblers 3 deep along the walls, all of them come to watch either a fool humiliated or a wrong finally set right, and none of them entirely certain which they would witness. Elvira wore her best dress, dark green wool with a high collar, her hair pinned back severe and plain. Nothing about her appearance meant to draw the eye, except the steady, level calm she had practiced for days to hold no matter what came. Oscar walked beside her through the crowd, his hand resting light but firm at the small of her back, and Silas Rhodes followed a step behind, his own spine straighter than it had been in weeks, dressed in his one good suit as though he meant to reclaim, in that single evening, every ounce of dignity the town had stripped from him. Cyrus Vane was already seated at his table when they entered, his silver hair oiled smooth, a fresh deck of cards sitting unopened at his elbow, and his cold blue eyes tracked Elvira's approach with an amusement he did not bother to hide. "Miss Rhodes," he said, rising with exaggerated courtesy and gesturing to the empty chair across from him, "I confess I did not expect you to go through with this. A laundress, sitting down to play a serious hand against a man of my experience. It is almost admirable in a foolish sort of way. I imagine you say that to encourage me to lose my nerve before we have even begun," Elvira said, taking her seat without hurry. "It will not work, Mr. Vane. I have not come here for admiration. I have come here for the deed to my father's homestead and for a public confession of exactly how you obtained it." A murmur went through the crowded room at that, and Vane's smile thinned a fraction, though he kept his tone light. "Bold words. Shall we agree on stakes, then, since you seem so certain of yourself? The deed to your father's land against what precisely? You have little enough left to wager, I should think." Elvira reached into the small bag at her side and withdrew a folded paper, which she set upon the table between them. "The remaining acreage my mother's family held in Kansas, sold 2 years past for cash my father has kept against hardship. It is not a fortune, but it is honest money, and it is everything we have. I wager it all against the deed to our homestead here, and against your word, spoken before every witness in this room, that you cheated my father out of it in the first place." The room had gone utterly silent now, every eye fixed on the table, and Vane's jaw tightened almost imperceptibly, though his smile never quite left his face. He had not expected her to raise such stakes so plainly, nor to demand a confession as part of the wager, and Elvira watched, exactly as she had trained herself to watch, for the small telltale signs of a man calculating his odds and finding them less comfortable than he had assumed. "Agreed," Vane said finally, because to refuse now before this crowd would have been its own kind of confession. 5-card draw, one hand, winner takes all. Shall we shake on it to make it official?" They shook, and the dealer, a nervous young man named Whitfield who worked the Golden Spurs tables and clearly wished he were anywhere else in the territory at that moment, produced a fresh, sealed deck at Oscar's insistence and broke it open before the whole room, shuffling it through slow and visible passes so that no one could claim afterward the deck had been tampered with in advance. Oscar stood just behind Elvira's chair, his eyes never leaving Vane's hands, watching for the small movements Elvira had taught him to recognize, the shift of a sleeve, the particular way a cheat's fingers might linger a fraction too long against the felt. Silas stood at the edge of the crowd, his hands clasped so tight his knuckles had gone white, his lips moving in what might have been prayer. The cards were dealt. Elvira lifted her hand slowly and looked at it without any change in her expression at all, though her heart was hammering fit to crack her ribs. She held a pair of eights, a jack, a 4, and a 2, not a strong hand by any measure, but not yet a lost one either. Vane looked at his own cards with the same practiced stillness, and for a long moment neither of them spoke. "Cards, Miss Rhodes?" Whitfield asked, his voice unsteady. "3," Elvira said, discarding the jack, the 4, and the 2, keeping her pair. Vane discarded 2, keeping 3 of his original cards, a choice that told Elvira, if she read it correctly, that he already held a strong pair or perhaps 3 of a kind and hoped to improve it further. She watched his hands as Whitfield dealt him his new cards, watched for the particular hitch Silas had described to her weeks ago, the fractional pause of a man exchanging a card for one hidden in his sleeve. She saw it. A small thing, so small most men in that saloon would never have noticed it at all, but Elvira had spent 10 days training her eyes for exactly this moment, and she saw the flicker of movement at Vane's cuff as he took his third card, saw the way his hand closed a fraction too quickly around it. Her own new cards came, and when she looked at them, her breath caught despite every ounce of training she had put into holding her composure. She had drawn a third 8, and, more improbably still, the 2 remaining cards gave her nothing more, a 5 and a 9 of no use to her hand, but the 3 8s alone were a solid hand, strong enough that many players would have wagered heavily upon it without hesitation. But she had seen Vane cheat. She had seen it with her own eyes, and now she faced the hardest choice of the entire evening, harder even than the choice to sit down at this table in the first place. She could call his bet and let the hand play out honestly, trusting 3 8s against whatever he had built through his hidden card, and risk that his cheat had given him something stronger still. Or she could do the thing her father had never quite managed to do on the night of his own ruin, the thing that required more nerve than any hand of cards ever dealt. She could call him out before he ever laid his cards upon the table. "Before we wager further," Elvira said, her voice carrying clear and steady through the silent room, "I should like to ask Mr. Vane a question if the house will permit it." Vane's eyes narrowed fractionally. "This is unusual, Miss Rhodes." "Indulge me," Elvira said. "You have just drawn a card. I watched you draw it, and I watched your left sleeve as you did so. I do not believe the card in your hand at this moment is the card Mr. Whitfield dealt you from the deck. I believe you have a card secreted in your sleeve, and I believe if any man in this room were to search you this instant, he would find it there, along with whatever card you discarded to make room for it." A roar of noise went up through the saloon at that, shouts and gasps and someone's chair scraping back hard against the floor, and Vane's face, for the first time all evening, lost its careful composure, going pale and then flushed with fury. "That is a dangerous accusation to make without proof," he said, his voice tight. "Then let us have proof," Oscar said, stepping forward from behind Elvira's chair, his voice carrying the flat, hard certainty of a man who has already decided how a thing will end. "You've got nothing to fear from a search if the lady's wrong, Mr. Vane. Stand up and let Mr. Whitfield check your sleeve, right here, in front of everyone. If she's mistaken, you'll have your confession from her instead, and this whole town will see the Rhodes name humbled twice over. Seems a fair trade for a man so certain of his own honesty." The crowd's noise swelled again, a current of demand building, cries of "let him search" and "stand up, Vane" rising from every corner of the room, until the pressure of it became a thing Vane could not simply wave away with his usual cool authority. He looked around at the packed saloon, at the faces no longer amused but hungry now for the truth, and Elvira watched something flicker and die behind his cold blue eyes, some final calculation reaching its inevitable, losing conclusion. "This is absurd," he said, But he did not stand, and his hesitation was its own answer, and the crowd knew it as surely as Elvira did. "Stand up, Cyrus," called a voice from the back. One of the claim owners Vane had likely cheated at some point himself, and others took up the call, and within moments the whole saloon had turned against him. The tide of public opinion he had ruled for so long through fear and money finally, irrevocably, turning the other way. Whitfield, sweating badly now, looked to Vane with something like an apology in his eyes and said, "Mr. Vane, sir, I believe you ought to stand up and settle this, for the good of the house's reputation if nothing else." Slowly, with the stiff dignity of a man walking to his own hanging, Cyrus Vane rose from his chair, and Whitfield, his hands trembling, reached out and drew back the cuff of Vane's left sleeve. And there, tucked into a small leather sheath sewn cunningly into the lining, was a single playing card, the ace of spades, along with the discarded 7 of clubs he had palmed away to make room for it. The room erupted. Elvira sat very still through the noise and the shouting, through the sight of 2 of the town's deputized men moving forward to take hold of Vane's arms, through Silas Rhodes pushing his way to the front of the crowd with tears standing openly in his eyes. And she found, in that moment, that she felt no triumph at all, only a great and settling calm, as though some enormous weight she had been carrying without fully realizing its size had finally been set down. "Before this house takes whatever action it deems fit," Oscar said, raising his voice over the tumult, "I believe Miss Rhodes is still owed a confession, per the terms Mr. Vane himself agreed to before every soul in this room." The crowd quieted at that, turning back toward the table, and Vane, his face gray now, his silver-templed dignity in ruins around him, looked at Elvira with something between hatred and a grudging, bitter respect. "Yes," he said finally, the word dragged out of him like a tooth. "Yes, I cheated your father, Silas Rhodes, that night 3 weeks past. I marked the deck before the game, and I dealt myself the cards I needed when his attention wandered. I have done the same to a dozen men in this town before him, and I would have done it a dozen more times besides, had this girl not been sharper-eyed than any of them." Silas Rhodes made a sound that was half sob and half laugh, and pushed forward to grip his daughter's shoulders, and around them the whole saloon broke into a roar of voices, some cheering, some cursing Vane, some simply talking over one another in the shock of it all. And through the middle of that roaring chaos, Elvira Rhodes turned to find Oscar Monroe's eyes already on her, warm and proud and full of a love neither of them had any more reason left to hide. The deed to the Rhodes homestead was returned that same night, drawn up fresh by the town's notary with Vane's own trembling signature upon it, witnessed by no fewer than a dozen men who had watched the whole confrontation unfold. Vane himself was escorted from the Golden Spur by the deputized men, and within the week, quietly sold his remaining interests in the town and departed Deadwood altogether, his reputation as ruined as Silas Rhodes's had been, only with far less sympathy attached to it. The Golden Spur passed into new, honester management, and the story of the gambler's daughter who had outplayed the crookedest man in the Black Hills became, within days, the sort of tale men told and retold over their evening drinks, growing a little larger with each telling, though Elvira herself never had much patience for the exaggerations. What mattered to her in the weeks that followed was watching her father slowly rebuild the man he had been before that terrible night, watching him walk down Main Street with his shoulders square again, watching the clerk at the mercantile meet his eyes without flinching, watching him laugh, actually laugh, at Mrs. Prout's stories over supper for the first time in what felt like 100 years. And what mattered even more, in the deepest and most private chambers of her heart, was Oscar Monroe. He had told her, that night after the game, walking her home beneath a sky wheeling bright with stars, that he had never in his life felt prouder of another person than he had felt watching her call out Cyrus Vane before that entire packed saloon. And Elvira had told him, in turn, that she did not believe she could have found the courage to do it at all, Had she not known, he was standing right behind her chair the whole time, watching her back the way he had promised he would. "I meant something else too, that night on the ridge," Oscar said, stopping at the gate of the little house, the same gate where they had stood weeks before after the trouble in the alley. "About building a future. I don't aim to let that be just words between us, Elvira. I've been thinking on it a good deal, and I don't see much point in waiting on feelings that are already about as certain as anything I've known in my life." Elvira's heart quickened, though she kept her voice light, teasing even, the way she had learned she could be with him and no one else. "And what exactly have you been thinking, Oscar Monroe?" He reached into his coat pocket, and Elvira saw in the moonlight that his hands were not quite steady, a small thing that undid her more thoroughly than any grand gesture could have. "I don't have a ring to offer you tonight," he said. "A cowhand's wages don't stretch that far, not yet anyhow. But I've got this." He produced a small, smooth stone, dark and polished, the kind a man might carry in his pocket for luck on a long trail. "It's off the land near my mother's ranch outside San Antonio. I've carried it with me on every drive I've ever made, and it has always brought me home safe in the end. I would like, very much, Elvira, if you would consider carrying it now as a promise, until such a day as I can put a proper ring in its place. I am asking you to marry me. I love you more than I believe I have words to properly say, and I do not want to spend one more day pretending otherwise to myself or to you." Elvira took the stone from his palm, closing her fingers around its smooth, sun-warmed weight, and felt tears rise hot and unexpected in her eyes. "Yes," she said, and then, laughing through the tears, "Yes, Oscar, of course, yes. I have been waiting for you to ask since that night on the ridge, though I would have asked you myself soon enough if you had taken much longer about it." He laughed too, relief and joy breaking across his face all at once, and he pulled her close and kissed her there at the gate, unhurried and certain, and somewhere behind the curtained window of the little house. Silas Rhodes, watching without either of them realizing it, allowed himself a small, satisfied smile and turned quietly away to give his daughter her privacy. They were married the following spring, in a small ceremony held in the yard of the Rhodes homestead, with new green grass coming up thick around the old fence posts Silas had built with his own hands so many years before, and the mountains standing tall and snow-capped in the distance beyond. Mrs. Pruitt organized the food, insisting it was the very least she could do, and half the town turned out, the same town that had once whispered Silas Rhodes's name like a curse, now calling out congratulations and pressing small gifts into the newlyweds' hands. And if there was a certain irony in that reversal, Elvira chose, on that particular day, to let it pass without comment. Silas Rhodes gave his daughter away with tears standing openly in his eyes, and when the preacher asked if anyone present had cause why the couple should not be joined, the whole yard fell into a silence so complete that even the birds seemed to pause, and then Silas himself broke it, saying in a voice thick with emotion, "No cause at all, only my deepest gratitude that my daughter found a man worthy of the courage she showed me, and showed this whole town, when it mattered most." And the gathered crowd laughed and applauded. And the ceremony continued, and Elvira Rhodes became Elvira Monroe beneath the wide Dakota sky, with her father's hand still warm from where he had placed hers in. Oscar's. They took over the homestead together, Oscar's knowledge of cattle and ranching combining with the land Silas had built, and within 2 years they had turned the modest acreage into a working ranch of real substance, running cattle across the gulchside pastures and building a new barn with lumber they could finally afford outright. Silas lived with them in a small addition built onto the side of the house, and he taught his grandchildren, when they came, the very same lessons in numbers and patience, and reading a person's face that he had once taught his own daughter at a kitchen table in Kansas, though he was careful always to tell them the story of how those lessons had once nearly cost the family everything, and how it had taken his daughter's own courage and her husband's steady loyalty to set it right again. Their first child arrived a little more than a year after the wedding, a son they named Sela's Oscar Monroe, with his father's steady dark eyes, and, as it turned out early on, his mother's fierce and stubborn will, evident from the first time he refused to be put down for a nap before he was entirely ready to be. 2 years after that came a daughter, whom they named Rose after Oscar's own mother, a bright and curious child who took to cards at far too young an age for Elvira's comfort. Though she and Oscar both found themselves laughing more often than scolding when they caught her practicing her shuffle with a deck of cards nearly as large as her small hands. Deadwood itself settled and grew calmer in the years that followed, the wildest edges of its gold rush days smoothing into something closer to an ordinary frontier town, with a proper schoolhouse eventually, and a church larger than the little chapel that had stood there when Elvira and Oscar married. Cyrus Vane was never heard from again in those parts, though rumor occasionally drifted back of a man matching his description running crooked games in towns further west, always one step ahead of a reputation that eventually, inevitably, caught up with him wherever he went. Elvira found she thought of him rarely, and without much bitterness when she did, for she had long since concluded that the best revenge available to her had already been taken, in full, on that single unforgettable night at the Golden Spur. On quiet evenings, once the children were settled and the ranch chores done, Oscar and Elvira would often sit together on the porch of the home they had built, much as Silas and his late wife had once built the original homestead, watching the sun go down gold and red over the hills. And Oscar would sometimes take the same small polished stone, now kept always in a little box on their bedroom dresser, beside the wedding ring he had eventually been able to afford, and turn it over in his fingers while he talked with his wife about the day's small events, the price of cattle, a fence that needed mending, a letter from his mother down in Texas full of news and blessings. "Do you ever think on it?" Elvira asked him once, some 5 years into their marriage, with little Silas chasing fireflies in the yard below and baby Rose asleep against her mother's shoulder. "How strange it was that you should ride into Deadwood at exactly the moment you did. If you had come a week earlier or a week later, none of this might ever have happened." "I think on it plenty," Oscar admitted, wrapping an arm around her shoulders and pulling her close against the evening chill. "I think the good Lord has a way of putting a man exactly where he is needed most, even when that man has no notion at all of what he is riding toward. I only know that the day I saw you standing up to those men outside the mercantile, basket on your hip and chin held high, I understood I was looking at the finest woman I would ever have the privilege of knowing, and I have thanked whatever Providence arranged that meeting every single day since." Elvira leaned her head against his shoulder, watching their son's small figure dart and laugh among the fireflies in the deepening dusk, feeling the warm weight of her sleeping daughter against her chest, and thought of her father inside the house, humming some old tune to himself as he mended a bit of harness by lamplight, a free and honored man again after all the darkness that had nearly swallowed him whole. "I used to believe," she said softly, "that the only thing that mattered in this world was winning back what had been stolen from us. I thought if I could only sit at that table and beat Cyrus Vane at his own crooked game, everything broken would be mended, and nothing more would be needed after that. I did not know, not truly, that I would win so very much more than a deed and a good name that night. I did not know I would win you." Oscar turned his head and pressed a kiss to her hair, and out in the yard their son let out a delighted shout as he finally caught a firefly cup between his two small hands, and somewhere behind them, through the open window, they could hear Silas Rhodes's low, contented humming carrying out into the soft Dakota evening, and Elvira Monroe, who had once been merely Elvira Rhodes, the gambler's disgraced daughter, closed her eyes and let herself simply rest in the fullness of everything she had fought for and everything, beyond all her hoping, she had ultimately gained. The years that followed brought their own small trials, as every life does, a hard winter that tested the herd, a fever that swept through the county and frightened them badly before passing without harm to their own household. The ordinary griefs and joys of a family growing and rooting itself deeper into the land it called home. But through all of it, the bond forged that autumn in Deadwood, between a cowboy who had chosen to stay when he might easily have ridden on, and a gambler's daughter who had refused to accept ruin as the final word on her family's story, only grew stronger, tempered rather than worn by time, the way good steel is tempered by fire rather than destroyed by it. Silas Rhodes lived to see both his grandchildren grow past their 10th birthdays, long enough to teach young Silas the particular satisfaction of a well-mended fence, and to teach Rose, despite her mother's initial reservations, an honest man's understanding of cards, the mathematics and patience of the game stripped clean of any temptation toward cheating. For he was determined in his remaining years that no Rhodes or Monroe would ever again know the particular agony he had once known. Kneeling in the mud of Main Street, with his reputation in ruins around him, he died peacefully in his own bed on a winter morning some 14 years after that fateful hand of cards, with his daughter holding one hand and Oscar holding the other, and his last words, spoken with a small, contented smile, were, "I am proud, Elvira. I have always been proud. Never doubt it." She never did. And so the ranch that had once nearly been lost to a crooked deck of cards became, in time, one of the most respected spreads in that stretch of the Dakota Territory, its cattle well regarded at market, its owners known throughout the county not for the drama of their courtship, though that story was told and retold at church socials and barn dances for years afterward, but for their steady generosity, their fair dealing, and the particular warmth of their hospitality toward any traveler who found himself in need of a hot meal and a place to rest, a kindness Oscar insisted upon always, remembering well what it had meant to him, all those years before, to be shown decency by strangers in an unfamiliar town. Elvira Monroe lived a long life, long enough to see her son Silas take a wife of his own and begin a family, long enough to see her daughter Rose grow into a sharp-eyed, clear-spoken young woman who managed the ranch's accounts with a precision that would have made her grandfather burst with pride, long enough indeed to sit on that same porch as an old woman with silver in her dark hair, Oscar beside her still, his own hair gone gray, but his eyes just as warm and steady as they had been the evening he first stopped outside her fence with his hat in his hands. "Do you regret any of it?" she asked him once, very late in their lives, watching their grandchildren play in the same yard where fireflies had once danced for their own children. "The drive you never finished, the wages you gave up, all of it, for a laundress and her ruined father in a town you had never meant to stay in longer than 3 days. Oscar took her hand, weathered now but still familiar to him in every line and callus, and pressed it to his lips. "I have never once regretted a single moment of it," he said. "Not the day I stopped, not the day I stayed, not any day since. I got the better end of that bargain 1,000 times over, Elvira Monroe, and I have known it every day since the moment you first smiled at me over a cup of cold coffee in your father's kitchen." The sun set that evening, as it had set over 1,000 evenings before it, gold and red across the hills where cattle grazed and children played. And if the story of the gambler's daughter who had won back her father's honor in a single hand of cards had long since become something closer to legend than memory in the town of Deadwood, it remained, for the two people who had lived it, something far simpler and far dearer than any tale told over a saloon bar. It remained, quite simply, the beginning of a love that had lasted the whole of their lives, and showed no sign, even now, of ever growing old.